Everyone involved in Southeast Asian studies on this campus already knows all about Mike Cullinane. Academic advisor, personal counselor, member of countless dissertation committees, teacher of popular undergraduate courses, and stalwart of the summer CSE program. Yet not everyone is aware of the depth and significance of his pioneering research into Philippine national and regional history, which has made him one of the world's leading historians of the Philippines with an unequaled mastery of the historical sources. During the depths of the Cold War, when America was containing the spread of global communism by sending special forces to teach counterinsurgency and Peace Corps volunteers to teach English, Mike volunteered for service on democracy's far-flung frontiers and spent 2 years in the late 1960s teaching math for the Peace Corps in Cebu Province in the Central Philippines. After completing his doctoral coursework at Michigan in Southeast Asian history, Mike returned to Cebu in the early 1970s to conduct research for an ambitious dissertation that planned to trace the historical evolution of this dynamic region over the span of 2 full centuries. Now, ordinarily, we would have expected that war, revolution, fire, and flood would have done their usual wonderful work as the historian's best friends, winnowing the thicket of documentation to produce a much more manageable and much more portable past. Sadly for Mike's dissertation, Cebu had been bombed and blasted, burned and flooded, but still the surviving documentation proved dauntingly dense. And to this day, 50 years after he started this research, Mike is still reading and learning about Cebu's history. So instead of producing a dissertation on Cebu that would not do justice to all this documentation, Mike stunned us all by changing topics mid-dissertation, something you should never do, by the way. Setting Cebu aside and producing a dissertation, soon a major monograph, on Filipino elite politics under U.S. colonial rule. After this path-breaking work on elite collaboration with both Spanish and U.S. colonial regimes, Mike then turned his attention to the processes of Philippine revolutionary mobilization, writing 2 important monographs, one on the seminal role of the escribiente, or the lowly scribe class in the National Revolution, and another on the character of guerrilla warfare on the island of Cebu during that same event. With that work on national history done, Mike has since returned to his research and writing about Cebu, continuing to produce a seemingly endless succession of fascinating findings. On a more personal note, over the span of 30 years, Mike and I have collaborated in producing 3 edited volumes on Philippine historiography, with major essays by Mike that illustrate the extraordinary diversity and depth of his research agenda, including first a study of the social history of Cebu in the 19th century. Next, a nuanced political biography of the provincial warlord Ramon Durano, which is nothing less than a definitive study of the country's persistent problem of privatized violence. And most recently, a multi-layered account of the Messianic religious leader Hilario Mercado, rich in insight about Philippine religion, Filipino migration to America, and the unique capacity of Filipinos to forge a transnational identity immersed in multiple societies. Running through this long engagement with the Philippines is a rich, multi-layered knowledge, a profound admiration for the country's culture, and an abiding fascination for both the fine detail and the grand drama of the Philippine historical pageant. Through his deep and abiding commitment to the field of Philippine history, moreover, Mike has not only produced a succession of seminal studies, but he has made his commitment a living testament to the significance of Philippine history within the broader field of Southeast Asian studies. Drawing upon these many decades of research into the history of Cebu, which has won him the rare honor of being deemed a son of Cebu by the place itself, Mike's talk today is titled Kinsa Si Juan Jiong, Historicizing the 1815 Uprising in Cebu. Thank you.
So the first thing also that I would like to say before starting this is that this is pretty dense, and there's a lot of things going on, and I realize that a lot of you don't know a lot about the Philippines, and we're going to get really grainy in this talk, so I think the Q&A should be very interesting. So let me start by getting away from the title slide and onto this one. So last summer, I was asked by the Office of the Mayor of Cebu City to present a lecture to commemorate Philippine National Heroes Day. The request was actually more specific. Would I present an address on Juan Jiong? While I was willing, I was curious why this would be an appropriate topic for National Heroes Day. But of course I agreed. On August 30, National Heroes Day, the day of the Zoom talk, I was greeted by about 5 members of the mayor's technical staff, all under 30, by my assessment, to prepare the live session and, of course, the Facebook link for the event. Before we went live, I asked the 5 techies, off the record, of course, if any of them had ever heard of Juan Jiong. None of them had. And yet my talk on this elusive national hero, in quotes, from Cebu was about to begin. This is just a basic outline of the talk itself. So I will tell you when we reach different points of it, but there's really only going to be, we'll have an introduction. I'll talk about the 1815 uprising very generally. Then we'll go into some looking at how I place this in a historicizing of the Central Philippines. And then I will conclude with partly stripping. And I'll tell you about that later. National Heroes Day. All right. And let me go one more slide because this is the actual national poster that people put up for National Heroes Day. This is the introduction. Nearly 100 years ago, in 1923, the prominent Cebuano journalist, author, and politician named Vicente Rama asked the readers of his popular Cebu City newspaper, Bagong Kusog, which Al has also read, right? He asked them, "Kinsa si Juan Jiong?" Who is Juan Jiong? While very few people at the time had any knowledge or perhaps interest in Juan Jiong or his uprising, Rama's question had a purpose, as we shall see. Success, 2 pages down. Beyond Rama, I was aware of 3 local legends about Juan Jiong that can be said to have been circulating in the 20th century. In one, he was depicted as a late 16th century native notable who resisted the efforts of Spanish friars to acquire landed estates in Cebu's hinterland. 16th century. In another, he was a skillful escrimador, swordsman, who led his townspeople in 2 battles, one against the Moros, Muslims, in 1825, and another against Spaniards attempting to usurp his lands in 1840. In yet another, he was described as a late 19th century rebel who contributed to Cebu's anti-Spanish revolt in April of 1898. There was no consensus about the identity of Juan Jiong, about the basis of his fame, about his enemies, or about when and where he lived. Fortunately for his readers, Vicente Rama had 2 sources deployed to answer his own question, who was Juan Jiong? The first was an article published in 1886 by a Fray Fabian Rodriguez, an Augustinian priest, who died in Cebu in 1902. This account, however, did not mention Juan Jiong, but described his uprising in some detail. In addition, Rama had tales from his political colleagues around the province of Cebu and was ready to spin his narrative. What happened? Rama described Juan Jiong as a farmer in Cebuano Magyuyuta, who had migrated from Bohol and acquired land in southeastern Cebu. The only enemy named in Rama's account was the notorious Datu Blas Tagaparian, a wealthy resident of the Chinese mestizo ghetto of Cebu City, who will return to our story momentarily. In collaboration with colonial officials, Datu Blas was accused of appropriating lands from Naga to Sibonga, we'll see the map later, along Cebu's southeast coast, where his carabaos cows, and goats were consuming the crops of local inhabitants. Damn, it's nasty. As discontent grew, Juan Jiong gathered an armed force and marched on Cebu City to demand the removal of these wealthy urban land grabbers. When the dissidents arrived in Cebu City, Rama reported that they could not locate any of the oppressors, neither the Chinese mestizo merchants nor any of the Spanish officials. Unable to confront their enemies, according to Rama, they returned to their homes and declared themselves free of the control exerted over them by these power holders from Cebu City. He also observed that the uprising had some curious support from the Augustinian Spanish friars of this parish, the municipality of San Nicolas. So the question here is, why would you tell this story in 1923? I know why. Sorry, Sam had this image on his computer for a very long time. Now he's going to finally figure out what it is all about. Resonating within the politics of the early 1920s, Vicente Rama clearly found this tale useful in a growing critique of a contemporary Datu Blas, a wealthy and powerful city-based Chinese mestizo increasingly seen by his opponents as abusing the rights of poor peasants and accumulating large provincial landholdings. It's hard to get that all out. Rama, of course, was referring to Sergio Osmeña, Cebu's most dominant politician at the time, and the scion of one of the city's most prominent Chinese mestizo families of the old Parian, and the largest, Osmeña, the largest landowner in Cebu Province in the 1920s. Allied with the Partido Democrata, opposition, the political machinations of Cebu, Rama was at the time literally on a collision course with Sergio Osmeña, this cartoon from Out of Bagong Kuso. It shows a very famous character in Philippines, the Juan de la Cruz, John Doe, the common man, with his, he's going to kick the shit out of this monster. And you have the Partido Democrata, here's Rama, several of his colleagues are trying to get down the road, and the evil Sergio Osmeña standing here, but he's going to club him to death, the monsters. So the caption reads, "For 18 years, I've suffered under your corrupt leadership. Move out of the way, you monsters." Thus, telling the story of a popular rural hero, Juan Jiong, standing up to a powerful exploiter was an attractive and purposeful model for the feisty editor in 1923. The political intrigues of the 1920s are, of course, worthy topics to pursue. But the concern of this discussion is not the politics of the early 20th century, but an effort to analyze what happened over a century earlier during the time of Juan Jiong. The sources mentioned thus far have constructed a disjointed view of the 1815 uprising. Cebuano legends tell of a timeless local hero, a bayani, right, Juan Jiong, striking out against colonial repression and land disposition. The Augustinian authors, however, depict an anonymous native community, unnamed, right, under their benevolent protection resisting rapacious Chinese mestizos. Vicente Rama's 1923 account confirms part of the Augustinian narrative, but fails to explore the larger context of these events. What happened in Cebu in 1815, and how can we explain this curious disturbance? Was it an anti-colonial upheaval, or just a contemporary local-level conflict? Who were Juan Jiong's enemies? Who were his allies? Where does this event fit in the history of this place? Or where does it fit in the history of the yet-to-be-imagined nation? We're now turning to a deeper explanation of the 1815 uprising in the outline. Unknown to Vicente Rama, the Spanish colonial authorities had conducted an investigation of this uprising only months after it occurred. This investigation was not known to Rama, but it was submitted by Cebu's provincial governor, Alcalde Mayor, Juan Nepomuceno de Andrade. And it confirms the year of the event as 1815. And it confirms the leadership of this disturbance as Juan Jiong. This official report described an outbreak not unlike that narrated by Rama. At the same time, it raised as many questions as it answered. The terms used by the Spanish report to describe the uprising included sublevación, motín, levantamiento, tumulto, alzamiento. It also described the people involved in the event as being rebeldes, insurgentes, amontinados, levantados, tumultuarios, and alzados. I know you don't know what those are. I know what they are. All these terms suggest that it was a rebellion against the constituted authorities. But was it a native uprising against Spanish rule? A closer reading of the report suggests that it was not. If not, what was it? The only other historically rooted account of the uprising, other than the investigation that I just mentioned, was that of the Augustinian Fabian Rodriguez, who wrote it in 1886 and published it in Spain, which provides a different analysis. As noted above, the account of Fray Rodriguez does not mention Juan Jiong, but concludes that Datu Blas, the rich Chinese mestizo, was the primary culprit, and that his actions were responsible for the discontent. The Augustinian accounts insisted that the rebellious natives were responding to legitimate grievances against wealthy urban land speculators, and that they, the Augustinians, were simply protecting their flock. The governors, these are some images that I'll cover. This is looking at the area that this occurred in. The governor's report acknowledged that the conflict was between two adversaries. The first was a large group of natives from Naga San Fernando, in the southern part, Naga San Fernando. Here's Cebu City. We're looking at this whole area is where everything happens. Naga and San Fernando are right here. Okay. That's why I have the big blue arrow. Can you see the big blue arrow? All right. So that the municipality, all of this at the time was a part of the municipality of San Nicolas. All right. The second group of adversaries were a couple of wealthy and influential Chinese mestizos from Cebu City, Datu Blas and his friend. All right. The governor, Andrade, however, defended the position of the Chinese mestizos, arguing that they had been granted legal access to the land in question by the colonial government. The governor instead criticized the native municipal officials, the principales of the town, and in particular their Augustinian parish priests, for both fomenting unrest and failing to contain the situation. So what actually happened? The official investigation described two episodes that took place between May and August of 1815, with the first being more threatening than the second. The center of discontent and the residence of Juan Jiong was reported to have been in Tinaan, Naga, a large village in the municipality. The primary incident involved a large group of armed residents, none it seems carrying firearms, who marched on Cebu City, gathering supporters along the way. Upon reaching the city, they sought an audience with the Spanish governor, Andrade, in order to register their complaints and to demonstrate their opposition to the land grants that he had been giving to these Chinese mestizo entrepreneurs. Blas Crisostimo, the notorious Datu Blas, and his partner, who now appears in the story, Gavino Rosales. I know you're dying to know what happens. Unable to establish contact with the Spanish authorities or the despised Chinese mestizos, the mob apparently entered Fort San Pedro. They entered the fort. The mob entered and removed at least one cannon and a quantity of gunpowder, manhandling an artillery officer. The cannon was then turned on the Casa Real, the official house of the Governor General. It's where he lived. But they didn't fire the cannon. They just aimed it at the house and then left. After what appears to have been a relatively short skirmish, the rebellious crowd departed, seemingly with the cannon and gunpowder, and began the trek back to their homes in the southern coastal villages. Though constructed as an assault on Cebu City, the incident was not depicted as having been particularly violent, and it did not end in any obviously conclusive manner. For example, there was nothing that could be called a battle, and there were no reports of casualties. So what happened next? The troublemakers took refuge in Tinaan, the place where Juan Jiong lives, today in the town of Naga, where they maintained contact with two Augustinian priests, Manuel Cordero from San Nicolas and Julian Bermejo of Boljoon, further down the coast, and with their native superiors, the principales of San Nicolas. After an inexplicable delay, Governor Andrade commissioned a local Spanish Creole, Mariano Rafols, in the government's employ to proceed with an armed force to Tinaan to investigate and report on the situation. In addition, he also had the gobernadorcillo, the head of the town of San Nicolas, Leon Santiago, and ordered him to gather a local force of residents and go to Tinaan and to arrest Juan Jiong and bring him back to Cebu for trial. Neither of the two expeditions appears to have accomplished its objective. This is critical. Yes. Enter Fray Julian Bermejo. This is a picture of him that I have never seen, because a friend of mine who lives in Valladolid in Spain found this in the hallway put up, and he said, "Oh, look, here's an old Spanish priest who served in the Philippines. I wonder," and he knew that he sent it to me. I said, "I think nobody has any idea what this guy looked like. But here's a painting of him." So I kind of like it. He's kind of cool looking guy. Julian Bermejo. The Rafols expedition seems largely to have devoted its time in congenial meetings with Fray Julian Bermejo, said to be in charge of the situation, and it resulted in a report favoring the opinion of this friar that the grievances of the local residents were justified because of the excesses of the Chinese mestizo merchants. But the peace and order, and that he, Bermejo, had promised the Creole coming down from Cebu City, everything's fine now, you can go home. As for the punitive expedition to be led by the gobernadorcillo of San Nicolas, it seems to have had no results. And with many of those who had been ordered to join the force having manufactured reasons why they were unable to comply with the order. After the call to action by the Capitan Leon Santiago, there was no indication that the native force ever made it to Tinaan, and certainly did not make any arrests of any of the troublemakers. A number of residents of San Nicolas, however, who were ordered to go on this tour, were arrested at this time for not complying with the orders of the governor. As prisoners in Fort San Pedro, many were interrogated by the governor himself and his group of officers. All of them claimed that they had been completely uninvolved in the first phase of the uprising, and that they had been imprisoned because of their alleged refusal to accompany the expedition down to Tinaan to arrest Juan Jiong. The interviews of these prisoners were recorded and provide valuable and interesting information about the alleged rebels. The general consensus was that Juan Jiong was the leader of the disturbance. He was often referred to by the prisoners as the cabeza de montín, the leader, the head of the mutiny. All right. He was described variously as a local constable, an alguacil, or a representative comisionado of Tinaan in this big town. His primary lieutenants were all described as local officials, including his son Carpio and his nephew Ayong, along with many others who came from Tubigon, Bohol, and now lived with him in Tinaan. Three others were frequently mentioned as part of the group of leaders. There was Felix Panday of Talisay. There was Andres Barasan, a cabo, a minor official of Tinaan. And there was Cabeza Mariano from Lipata, Minglanilla, all of them from this coastline. They were described actually as escribientes, or clerks. And Al knows, I love escribientes. Whenever you find an escribiente, it's a clerk. You gotta love clerks. So, all right. When asked about the reason for Juan Jiong's action, the prisoners claimed the primary objective of these men was to regain lands taken from them by the Chinese mestizos of Cebu City. As one respondent stated, Juan Jiong's march on Cebu City was, quote, solely aimed against Blas and Gavino, unquote. Both these Chinese mestizos are easily identified in Cebu's notarial records, and I know a lot about both of them. Blas Crisostimo Valle and Gabino Rosales Reynes were wealthy and influential residents of Cebu City's Parian. Cebu City. Parian. So where do you think the rich people live? This is pretty scattered. This is Cebu City. The governor lives right here. Right? This is the fort. This is the Jesuits and a few scattered houses, the two big churches. But the fat cats live here across this stream. That's the Pario. That's where the Chinese mestizos live. And they're very rich. Though most of the hostility was aimed at these two entrepreneurs, it was acknowledged that their claim of access to the contested lands we had mentioned before was legally sanctioned by the colonial government, and Andrade, the governor, confirmed this. Governor Andrade defended the Chinese mestizos, but made serious accusations against the Augustinian priests, while also expressing his dissatisfaction with the Spanish bishop Joaquin Encabo de la Virgen de Sopretran. So he's even bad-mouthing the bishop. This is a Spaniard bad-mouthing a Spanish bishop. Andrade recommended immediate action against the Spanish parish priest in San Nicolas, telling the bishop to remove him from office. The governor's primary ire, however, was aimed and directed at Fray Julian Bermejo, who we saw a moment ago, who the governor argued was meddling in civil affairs and was protecting the mutineers. These accusations were submitted to Manila, where they were reviewed by the authorities in Manila, resulting in the appointment of a commissioner to be sent to Cebu to conduct an independent investigation. When the uprising was assessed, from the viewpoint of the Augustinians, however, a very different construction of the events emerged, revealing that these friars were at odds with both the Chinese mestizos and the governor, and that Fray Julian Bermejo and his priestly brothers saw themselves as defending the people of their parishes, which had been, these parishes had been an Augustinian parish area since the 16th century, so for almost 200 years by this point. It is therefore not surprising that the Augustinian accounts of the events were told almost entirely in the context of the biography of Fray Julian Bermejo. This is only to prove my authority on Chinese mestizos of Cebu. All right. The Augustinians constructed Bermejo as a héroe, a hero, all right, a man who had negotiated peace and was falsely accused by the governor. As noted, the name of Juan Jiong does not appear in the Augustinian records of them, despite the fact that this unnamed native was clearly at the forefront of this affair, and as confirmed by most of the prisoners in Fort San Pedro that had been interviewed by the governor. In the Augustinian accounts, Fray Bermejo stands out as the central hagiographic figure. He has been universally credited with the construction of the effective anti-Moro defense system, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, launched a decade earlier. After examining the documents at his disposal in Boljoon Parish in the 1880s, Fray Fabian Rodriguez, a later Augustinian priest, praised Father Bermejo's efforts to build what he called a Christian army to defend the parishioners. In reviewing Bermejo's role in the 1815 uprising, his later brother, Rodriguez, concluded that his priestly predecessor was well placed to pacify these natives since he was in command of a 300-strong army of hombres armados, armed men, his Christian army, comprising many of those who were involved in the upheaval, including Juan Jiong. Both Governor Andrade in 1815 and Fray Rodriguez in 1886, as well as later Augustinian authors, focused their attention on Fray Julian Bermejo, but for different reasons. For Fray Rodriguez, Bermejo was an altruistic shepherd of his flock. For Governor Andrade Bermejo's colonial superior, the friar had walked a thin line between loyalty and disloyalty to the Spanish crown. Though Andrade accused him of treason and of fomenting native discontent, Bermejo remained unrepentant. And though he feigned obsequiousness, even friendship with the governor, he also wrote his own memoria to Manila, his own report, to the Manila authorities. As it turns out, when all is said and done, the special commissioner who comes down from Manila makes no effort to punish Fray Bermejo. He's clean in the end. This is Fray Bermejo, in case you didn't figure. Standing in front, this is of course today. He's still there in front of the bulwark against the Muslims. He's facing out to the sea where the Muslims come from. All right, so turning now to the main part of where historicizing comes in. Yeah, this is the boring part. So, 1815, Cebu between Retirada and Reconquista. Elsewhere, I have devoted considerable discussion to the decline of Spanish colonial state and church in Cebu and the Central Visayas during the period from the 1740s to the late 1820s. And that's a hell of a lot of words. No one wants to read that. Just believe me. But these are the issues. So I've defined these things. By the end of the I'm saying that between 1740s and the late 1820s, this was a period of retirada, retreat. The Spanish retreated from their colonial area, leaving the thing back. In the late 1820s until the end of Spanish rule, they come back. And I call that period a reconquista, a reconquest of the area that takes place during that time. The uprising of Juan Jiong occurred at the end of the retirada, but exposed many of the critical issues that would define the early stages of the reconquista. So, our terms, the boring part. Yes, my people. In many ways, each of the 6 major individuals involved in the 1815 conflict characterized the prevailing colonial condition in the last 2 decades of the retirada. So I'll run through our characters, cast of characters. Bishop Sopetran's beleaguered sea. Cebu's recollect bishop, Joaquin Encabo de la Virgen de Sopetran, could barely administer his vast diocese during the time that he served. He relied on a small group of native clergymen and appealed to Madrid to send him more friars. I need more Spaniards. As such, he was reluctant to make accusations against the few Augustinians within his domain at the time. And he also could not make a lot of demands against the Chinese mestizos because many of the Chinese mestizos were running his diocese as priests. He's stuck. Mariano Rafols, I call him the diminished Spanish quarter. He's a Creole. He comes from an Iberian-born family that pretends to still be Spanish. Right? And what my argument here is the Creole status of this emissary to go down and figure out what's going on of the governor mattered little in the urban area in 1815. Place and privilege at this time had to be earned with money, right? Not inherited. This will change in the Reconquista. Despite his Iberian origin, he was just a native-born subject of a declining Spanish empire, and without much wealth, his survival depended on serving the representatives of the Spanish king, in this case, the governor. The governor himself, Mayor Alcalde Nepomuceno, his elusive realm is similar to that of the bishops. Right? He administered a jurisdiction where his authority was uncertain and his power contingent. His commercial entanglements, however, with the Chinese mestizos allowed him to profit from being the governor, but it compromised his capacity to command. In 1815, his choices brought him into direct confrontation with the only other influential Spaniards in this domain, the Augustinians. Datu Blas and his friends. Blas Valier and many of the other Chinese mestizos were the wealthiest and most influential urban residents of Cebu at this time. At the time, they were essential in administering both state and church, and dominated nearly all sectors of wealth accumulation. The only worry that Datu Blas had was whether the governor, his business partner, could contain the angry mob, and the Augustinians, his most ardent opponents. Fray Julian, what can we say about him? In 1815, only 4 Spanish priests resided in this very large Augustinian jurisdiction in southeastern Cebu. 4 white dudes running over this whole area. Julian Bermejo was one of the most dynamic among them. He understood the retirada and dedicated himself to reverse its impact. He was at the forefront of efforts to resist Moro incursions, which both protected the interests of his Christian mission and the natives under his jurisdiction. In 1815, these objectives led him to deploy his hombres armados, his Christian army, to challenge the assertive Chinese mestizo merchants as well as the colonial state. Juan Jiong, the agency as lungsurano, and we'll get a definition of this one. Sadly, Juan Jiong remains a mysterious and voiceless figure, revealed through a few fragments embedded in local memory and an inconclusive collection of documents pertaining to the uprising remembered in his name. As the indisputable leader of the mutiny, cabeza de motín, he was undoubtedly a major representative of the municipality of San Nicolas, making his situation worthy of further analysis. Cebu City. Again, fort, Chinese mestizos, Jesuits, some mostly not Spanish, some Creoles living in here. Then you just head out this way and you cross over this little stream. San Nicolas, the major church for going all the way down the southeast coast of Cebu, is based right there. So we want to remember that. The decline of the friars in both numbers and influence during the retirada resulted in the emergence of more recognizable socio-political communities of municipal residents. Municipal residents, mga lungsuranon, all together? No, forget it. and more self-reliant, even assertive municipal officials, principales, okay? The principal people of the town. Under its local leaders, the residents of San Nicolas, along with those of the 3 other Augustinian parishes of southeastern Cebu, comprised the most organized native settlements in the Visayan region, and Al will of course want me to say central Visayan region, but I don't know. So, the pioneers interrogated by Governor Andrade whether his followers or his accusers confirmed that Juan Jiong was well known from San Nicolas to Boljoon. Over 100 kilometers of coastal settlements divided into 5 municipalities operating as 4 Augustinian parishes with a population reported to be nearly 27,000 souls. Spanish count people by souls. They count almas, not bodies. Oh, we'll talk about that. 3.5 times. So that population is 27,000, is 3.5 times more inhabitants than resided in Cebu City at that time. Significantly, Juan Jiong was described as a minor municipal official, a minor principal, of a large village of Tinaan in the pueblo of San Nicolas as it goes down this coast. A sprawling, though familiar geography for those who resided there. In 1815, the villagers from this place had been part of the colonial jurisdiction for well over a century, and nearly everyone residing within it owed allegiance to the gobernadorcillo who lived in San Nicolas way up the coastline. Right. Moreover, all their life events, births, baptisms, marriages, deaths, burials, right, were meticulously recorded in the parish registers by a familiar native fiscal, a clerk, right, under the supervision of a single Spaniard, an Augustinian, who inhabited the rectory convento attached to San Nicolas Church, less than a kilometer from Cebu City's fort and Governor Andrade's office. Church is right there. Andrade's office is right there. The fort is right there. You can easily walk it. The resilience of these municipalities scattered along this narrow coastline is testimony to the fact that they had become established communities composed of residents who performed their religious practices, raised their families, pursued farming, fishing, and local commerce, selected their leaders in a prescribed manner, routinely delivered their taxes and labor services, and reconstructed or reconstituted their communities after Moro raids. San Nicolas had long ceased to be a missionary frontier. By 1815, it was a Christian municipality comprised of native population that possessed their own reasons to defend and develop their villages. By 1808, the people of these coastal villages responded readily to the efforts of Fray Bermejo to construct watchtowers and build a fighting force to defend these communities from Muslim raids, in the Philippines, Moros. Their initial successes were not only based on following the orders of a foreign missionary, but on the realization that they had communities to defend. As their agency in these endeavors increased, new leaders emerged among them, and their victories over Moros were increasingly constructed as triumphs of their religion and associated with public rituals and performances initially organized by their priests, but increasingly organized by them. These residents, or vecinos, right, shared many things with Fray Bermejo, a man who on a regular basis demonstrated his solidarity with them and whose influence with higher authorities facilitated their efforts to defend their communities. For most of these mga lungsuranon, right, townspeople, in 1815, their primary livelihood was also being challenged by urban-based Chinese mestizo capitalists who were at the same time on a collision course with their Augustinian benefactors. It's coming together. Okay. The effort to overcome Moro interventions brought many of these mga lungsuranon more clearly into view, with one of the most revealing aspects of Fray Bermejo's Christian army being the emergence of prominent anti-Moro fighters from among these communities. Although Augustinian sources give most of the credit to Bermejo, prominent native leaders among the earliest named, they are among the earliest people actually named, natives who show up with a name in Spanish records, are featured in these narratives. In his hagiographic account of Fray Bermejo, Fray Rodriguez refers to 6 locally renowned leaders, describing them as intrepid and daring natives, indios intrépidos y arriesgados, It's interesting. Including among them, he says, El Celebre, the famous. Famous to who? It's like the famous Capitan Briones of Oslo. I know you don't know where Oslo is, but it's in this district. It goes without saying that the results of Bermejo's defensive and offensive networks could not have been successful without considerable native participation, ingenuity, and leadership. In assessing the consolidation of these Augustinian parishes, it is significant to emphasize the agency of the residents of these communities, especially by local leaders who made this system work and who, despite obvious grievances, collected tribute, maintained peace and order, supervised and labored on the construction of anti-Moro watchtowers and Catholic churches, and took the lead in establishing what later observers would call communities of lowland Christian Filipinos. As such, the most relevant anecdote about Juan Jiong is that he was recalled as a skillful warrior involved in early 19th century combat with Moro raiders. As a renowned soldier trained to repel Moro attacks, he was obviously part of the extensive coastal defense force established under the initiative and command of Fray Julian Bermejo. Based on Governor Andrade's investigations, Juan Jiong and other rebeldes, were in close association with Fray Bermejo, the key figure, Fray Bermejo, in resolving the conflict. In other words, Juan Jiong was part of Bermejo's Christian army. Why then does his name disappear in the Augustinian records? Local legends, as well as historical records, proclaim that Juan Jiong was a minor official of San Nicolas, was a major leader in the anti-Moro fighting force deployed along Cebu's southeastern coast during the first 2 decades of the 19th century. These same sources indicated that he and those associated with him were not only threatened by Moro raiders, but were also a small body of affluent entrepreneurs. They were now being threatened by a small body of affluent entrepreneurs from Cebu City's Parian, the Chinese mestizos. These Chinese mestizos acknowledged, I might add that the Chinese mestizos were a devout Christian community. Both are devout Christians. So it has nothing to do with who you believe in. All right. The Chinese mestizos acknowledged the spiritual jurisdiction of the Augustinians over their parishes, but the Chinese mestizos challenged their ownership of the lands in question. The colonial government, in fact, had given them access to these lands. As such, the uprising that ensued not only represented the interests of Juan Jiong and his mga lungsuranon, but also those of their Spanish parish priests, the Augustinians. The Chinese mestizos and their colonial benefactor, Governor Andrade, threatened both the residents of San Nicolas and the Augustinian order. The potentially seditious nature of Bermejo's involvement as a likely provocateur of this conflict makes it clear that Juan Jiong, the indisputable leader of this uprising, could not be mentioned in any Augustinian account, certainly not as a leader closely associated with the priest. Remember, the priest is fighting an investigation to prove that he's not subversive. Some 5 years later, after the uprising was over in 1820, there were few indications that this upheaval had any significant impact. Juan Nepomuceno de Andrade was still the governor of Cebu in 1820. Fray Julian Bermejo was still the prestigious parish priest of Boloon. For their parts, neither of the two maligned Chinese mestizos, Datu Blas or Gabino Rosales, confessed to or were accused of any illegal infractions. And with the backing of Governor Andrade, both the Chinese mestizos submitted a formal request to the government to assist them in moving their carabaos, cattle, and cows to a safer pasture area. Of course. These requests were approved by the government, and their animals were transferred to the nearby barrio of the town of Carcar. Both Chinese mestizos retained their wealth and power, while their urban municipality and parish thrived, and along with other entrepreneurs of this district, they continued to expand their land holdings into the nearby urban hinterland, an area ostensibly controlled by the Augustinians. Bishop Sopitran died in 1818 and was not replaced for 5 years, during which time the Cebu diocese was in part governed by Chinese mestizo secular priests. The only person missing in this complex menagerie of characters in the aftermath of this uprising was Juan Jiong, its leader, who quietly and quickly disappeared into legend. A brief conclusion. I hope it's brief. All right. It is easy to view 1815, for me, the uprising, as a manifestation of the Spanish retirada, a time when natives, both mga Lungsuranon and Chinese mestizos, rose to very high levels of involvement. It was also, in terms of the Reconquista, the uprising, which is coming in the late 20s, 1820s. In case of the Reconquista, basically what we see is that the conflict would dominate, that this conflict between Augustinians and Chinese mestizos dominates the book that I wrote on the Chinese mestizos, because it is an all-out war between Augustinians and Chinese mestizos for the first half of the 19th century. Without support from colonial officialdom, represented locally by Governor Andrade, Fray Bermejo's involvement in this disturbance was a bold act, since the land grant of the Parian entrepreneurs had been endorsed by the government. Bermejo took a risk by sanctioning the deployment of his Christian army against the Chinese mestizos and the local representatives of the colonial state. It was perhaps fortuitous that the uprising was not terribly violent, and that it kind of passed in the night and not many people died. Right? From 1815 to 1849, having successfully overcome allegations of treason, right, Fray Julian moved to the forefront of the Augustinian confrontation of against the Chinese mestizos and the reassertion of Spanish hegemony in this region, which it definitely happens. Right? In 1827, he again deployed his Christian army, this time to the Governor General of the Philippines expedition to reconquer Bohol from the followers of Francisco de Gojoy, who had revolted there in the 1740s. So his Christian army of natives is used then to attack Bohol and destroy this native community that had been there since the middle of the 18th century. He's on the right side that time. Bermejo was the prior of the Convento de Santo Nino for all but 7 years between 1825 and 1852. And for most of this period, he joined Spanish officials representing both church and state in the successful confrontation against Chinese mestizo men, but that I'm sad to say is a story for another day, because it will take quite some time. So, the last part. I'm removing my shirt, sorry. This is part of the drama. Be ready. The most important saint of Cebu lives in the Convento de Santo Nino, in the center of Cebu City.
Could be a tattoo, man.
Yes, it has. It has been attacked by earthquakes, and he always lives. All right. It is appropriate, therefore, to conclude this discussion with one of the many Milagro ni Santo Nino, miracles of the Santo Nino, of Cebu. A milagro, a miracle, that is embedded in the major legend about the uprising of Juan Jiong. Whoa! It is told that when Juan Jiong's armed force of angry peasants arrived in Cebu City, threatening the entire urban population, hostilities were averted by the intervention of the Holy Child. the miraculous image housed in the Augustinian monastery at the center of the Ciudad de Cebu. In the form of a small boy, the Niño Jesus appeared before Juan Jiong and convinced him to go to the Augustinian convento to meet with the Bishop of Cebu and to explain his grievances to the bishop against the land grabbers. The same child appeared before the bishop, preparing him for a peaceful negotiation with Juan Jiong. As the miracle contends, Juan Jiong and the bishop met in the Augustinian parish, right, and resolved the controversy. Satisfied, Juan Jiong and his followers are reported to have retreated to their homes without a cannon, and Cebu City was saved and peace prevailed. As we say in Cebu, Viva Santo Nino. I might say, Viva los Agustinos. Long live the Augustinians. Over a century later, in 1923, Vicente Rama, the local journalist and political opponent of the contemporary Chinese Mestizo kingpin Sergio Osmeña, had no interest in promoting any Spanish priest. Nevertheless, Rama conjured the image of Juan Jiong as best he could to remind his readers of the rebellion of an oppressed municipal leader and his followers who protested the politically motivated exploitation of their rural communities by Osmeña's ancestors. Back to the beginning. While Juan Jiong vanished at the end of 1815, his legends persist. His uprising has been appropriated for multiple causes: challenging Spanish rule, resisting Moro incursions, opposing Chinese Mestizo land grabbers and provincial oligarchs, and representing Cebu as a candidate now for a Filipino national hero. As such, in 2021, the mayor's office in Cebu City solicited this talk. This is the second time the talk is heard. The first time was there, back in August. And it solicited this talk to insert a regional hero into the national discourse, proposing that Juan Jiong, though, and this comes right from the quote of, this is the national advertisement for the National Heroes Day. And it says, even though you are not a Jose Rizal, right, and you can find the quote right here, but also should include those whose names have been forever lost to history. In historicizing Juan Jiong, however, his national legacy is ambiguous and certainly does not correspond to the Philippine nationalist narrative. Juan Jiong's enemy was neither the friars, we all hate the friars, nor the colonial state per se. I hate the colonial state. It was an indigenous elite that emerged from Spanish colonialism. It's an indigenous elite that emerged from Spanish colonialism. In fact, it was largely the same elite that was politically empowered by the American colonialism several years later and opposed by Vicente Rama a little over a century after this. Perhaps that's what the mayor of Cebu City had in mind, finding national heroes that focus more on the enemy within. Thus, we move from Mabuhi ni Juan Jiong, si Juan Jiong, which is Cebuano, to praising him as a local hero. We could now move to Mabuhay si Juan Jiong, honoring him as a national hero. Tapos na.